So quick review as we get started here. What are the four basic things plants need to thrive? That'd be sunlight, air, nutrients, and water. And we've talked about the first three over the first couple sessions. I'm going to talk a little bit about water. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so watering. Do you need to water? Well, yeah, in the summer around here, it gets very dry, right? We can actually go 6, maybe even 8 weeks without watering or without a substantial amount of rain. So you really do need to water around here. And how you want to water really is deeply and infrequently. And we'll talk more about what that means. But in general, if you are planting your garden in the ground, containers are a little bit different, and I'll talk about container plants in a little bit. But gardens in the ground or a raised bed that's just slightly raised, in general, that usually means 2 or 3 times a week, a really good soaking. But it can depend on an awful lot of different factors: the soil type, the location, the plants themselves, and Mother Nature. What's it like outside, right? Is it kind of like today, it's a little bit sunny but cool? Is it moist? Is it 95 and screaming winds that are really hot? Those all make a huge impact. So we'll dig into each one of these a little bit more as we go through this. The first thing we're going to talk about is that soil type. So the type of soil does make an impact on not only how often you have to water, but really it's because of how well does the soil hold the water itself. There's 3 basic types of soil: sandy soil, clay soil, and then loamy soil. So sandy soil, water really doesn't retain much, or the soil doesn't retain a lot of water. The particles are really small. So think about at the beach, you're at the beach, the tides come in, the water funnels through that really quickly, right? On the other end of the spectrum, clay soil, if you've got clay in your backyard this time of year or previous weeks, months, you would know it, right? It really holds water. You go try to dig this time of year and it's going to have a lot of water held in it. And then the loamy soil is really a good mixture of those two. It retains the water very well, but not so well that it'll rot out your plants. And last week we talked about adding items to your soil, what makes a good soil. There was talk about potting soil and how to make that, and why it's important to invest in good soil. And a lot of that ties into that water retention itself. How do you check if you need to water, right? You think that it might be time to water, but how do you really tell? Looking at the top layer of soil really is not a good indication if you need to water or not. What you need to do is stick your finger down into the soil an inch or 2 and see if it's moist down in there. And if it is, then you're probably good to go. But if it's dry, an inch, 1 inch, 2 inches down into the soil, then it's time for a good soaking. And the picture down in the bottom right-hand corner here is actually of a plant that's wilting. It's time to water that one. What you don't want is for your plants to look like that. Hopefully you're watering them more frequently enough that they're not wilting. So some common watering problems that you might experience throughout the season. One can actually be watering too much. You wouldn't think overwatering can be a problem, but it can. In part depending on the type of soil, how well it holds the water, but also a lot of plants just don't want to sit in really drenched water. They want to dry out a little bit. If you've ever had house plants, a lot of them, that's a good indication. That's what I'm talking about. They don't like to sit there and wet every single day. They get unhappy. So not only is it not good for your plants, but quite honestly, it's just a waste of water. And it causes your nutrients to leach away much faster than if you're just watering when you need to. And in really extreme conditions, it also can create a moldy environment because your plants are just too wet all the time. Another common problem is frequent and shallow watering. So I talked about watering really deeply, and there's a reason you want to do that. So on the right-hand side here, we have a picture of a plant that is watered quite frequently and has a really shallow root system on the bottom right-hand corner. But on the left-hand side is a good healthy plant with a deep root system. And the reason for that is that we talked about, I mentioned letting the soil dry out at the top. If you're watering really deeply and the water's down 3, 4, 5 inches, as it starts to dry out at the top layers, the roots are actually going to be searching for that moisture, and they're going to be pushing down deeper into the soil. Whereas if you're watering on a really regular basis every day, the water's sitting up at the surface and the plants are literally going to build their root structure like is shown there on the right, and they're just going to be hanging out at the top. And then you get a spell where you're gone for a couple days, or it gets super hot and it dries out. They're impacted much faster by you losing that's water mass at the top inch or two. Okay, so watering methods. We did a survey, right? And most of you said you'd be hand watering. But let's talk a little bit about each of these types of watering. So we've got a couple pictures here of hand watering, whether you're using a container or a hose. You know, it's quick. It's not quick, it's easy. It's inexpensive to get the materials to do that, but it does take a fair amount of time, especially when you really think about you want to go around and water really deeply. That can take a fair amount of time. But it is by far the least expensive investment that you've got. And then there's drip irrigation. A couple people said that they're going to consider drip irrigation. That's really great. It gets right to where the plants actually need the water at the roots themselves. You can determine exactly how long you're going to water. So that is really helpful, and do that for a longer period of time. But it is a higher cost investment. And I can tell you from experience, if you're putting in a drip irrigation system, it takes time to put that in, even if it's just for one raised bed. I can't tell you how many plants I have gotten excited and bought and put in the ground, and then a warm spell comes and I didn't get a sprinkler system set up, or I didn't hand water them frequent enough. So if you're putting in drip, think about planning ahead, getting that put together. And then the last one is overhead sprinklers. Again, pretty low investment, right? You can go get them at Bimart or the Home Depot or any location pretty easily. They're easy to set up, not that expensive. There is higher evaporation with those, or higher water waste. That should say water waste there, because they will, especially in the heat of the day, it'll evaporate. So if you are using sprinklers, I would recommend early in the morning, late at night, not in the heat of the day, so that you're not having as much water evaporate into the air. So different plants have different needs. Let's go ahead and pop through. There we go. So depending on the type of plant it is or how old it is, can impact how often you need to water. Seedlings, they're the most delicate in terms of their root structure, right? We watched a video last week of Lynn planting, and she showed those roots, and there's not a real big root structure when you're planting the young plants. So they need to be kept really moist. And of course, seeds, if you're planting directly in, same thing, they need to be kept moist to germinate and get those root structures developed. Growing plants, as they start to establish themselves, you don't need to water them as often. And that's when you really do want to water them, get the water really deep down in there. And this talks here, the note says 6 inches. So one way to check that, if you're not sure how long that will take, is you could actually take some of your soil and put it in a pot, a yogurt container, a planter container, 5-gallon pot or something. And however you're watering your garden, you could also water that and see how long it takes to really get the water soaked into that container. And that might be a good indication. And then the types of plants that they are, and their root structures may play an impact on how long and how frequently you need to water as well. Some examples of shallow rooted plants. Think of an onion. If you ever have grown an onion or seen the root structure of an onion, they're not very long. They're just a couple inches. Whereas a tomato, that would be an example of a deep rooted plant. Again, we watched the planting video last week, and You know, if you saw that, it was planted in the ground to even start with a good 6 or 8 inches, and then it'll grow even further down in. So the type of plant, the type of root structure is going to play an impact on how frequently you need to water. So let's talk about containers for a minute, because they are a little bit different. When I say water a couple times a week, that all those rules go out the door when you're talking about containers. They dry out much faster. I really would recommend you checking your containers every single day. And even throughout the growing season, not only the temperature will impact how often you need to water, but the plants and how old they are will as well. The early ones, when they're young, talked about, you know, shallow root structure, not a very good root structure. You need to water them a lot. But I also find then at the end of the season, when I've got plants that have a lot of roots, they'll suck up water really fast too. So for me, my pots, I actually end up having to water them most of the time in August, twice a day. They get a lot of sun. So keep an eye on those and make sure you're watering them very frequently. So I saw this in the slide deck as I was putting this together and thought this was a great example here of putting together a watering can that isn't very expensive, right? You buy a gallon milk at the grocery store, you can actually convert it. And if you've got kids that like to garden, this would be a great way to get them all their own containers. Just save that milk carton, clean it out, get a pair of scissors or something that you can poke the top with and poke some holes in and create all the kids their own little watering cans. Okay, so does anybody have questions on watering?
Carol, do we have any questions that came up in the chat?
Yeah, the questions that have been well, about when do you need to start watering? And I referred to your comment about paying attention to the soil, signals from the soil, what's going on with the weather and such. But then remembering also, if people are planting seeds or transplants, there may be more need for watering. And I think you covered that pretty well in terms of keeping the soil moist for seeds and such. So if anybody is confused by my back and forth there, please don't hesitate to ask another question. You could even unmute here if you think you want to. There is one question from TK. It says, what do you think about composting garden beds? And TK, I'm just going to say right now that we'll get to that question since it doesn't sound like it's directly related to watering.
We're talking about composting and mulches in just a minute, in fact.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Very good.
And I think when I see like the number one failure I see happen in new gardens is people who have this beautiful garden and they have a way to water it, and then they don't have a way to water when they go on vacation. Because if you're using hand watering as your main system, then and you're investing a whole bunch of time every day out there with your watering, sometimes it can be hard to find someone else to come in and take care of that for you. So if you can find a gardening friend and make a pact to take care of each other's gardens while you're gone, it can make a big difference in having some garden success. And the drip irrigation with a timer can also take care of that, but it is a bigger investment of setup time and of money.
I agree with you completely. I will tell you, the first few years, when I moved to a new house and we gardened, I did not have an automatic sprinkler system. And I'll tell you, we didn't go on vacation in the summer because I was nervous to leave for very long or have the teenage kids, you know, in the neighborhood water. So yeah, if you've put all that time and effort into it, make sure you've got a system that'll work or some buddies that will help. Nothing worse than coming home and finding out your plants are dead because you went on vacation.
So I have made a counting chart. Like when I'm hand watering, I'll count how many seconds. I mean, if I have to turn over my garden to somebody else and I'll say, can you come over and water this area here? And I'll say, please stand here for 60 seconds and actually count it out. And it seems like forever if you're not used to watering. So, and doing the test and coming back, you know, after you've watered what you think is deeply, I come back and test it and put my finger in there, take a little trowel and make sure how deep that got, because it's surprising how long it takes to really saturate.
And especially when the water or when the soil has dried out,
Yes.
right? So you can water, a container is again a really good example. You can water a big container. If the soil has gotten completely dry, it'll start dripping through there after a while, but it actually, the soil hasn't reabsorbed some of the water, and it can take a while for that to reabsorb. So you dry things out, you've got to really soak it even longer than you would if you're maintaining it on a regular basis.